And we are live. Okay, I hope everybody can hear me. At least I have a friend who's said to inform me if you guys cannot, and hopefully to also inform me if you guys can. This episode, I'm sad to announce that I do not have an intro because I've switched to StreamYard, and I had to switch to StreamYard because instead of an intro, this time I have a Protestant with me. I thought, every great man has kind of like a sidekick. We have Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson. We have, I have no more examples. And so I got myself a real historian, Christopher Sandberg. Christopher, say hello.
How's it going? The American. Whenever I first started doing, content, I was always basically that. I would just be the guy that would float around to different shows whenever people needed an expert or something. And in America, there used to be a show called the David Letterman Show, and there's a kind of a famous musician, Warren Zevon. He did the song "Lawyers, Guns, and Money" and everything like that. And he used to be kind of what I did for these shows, and he would occasionally fill in for the band members whenever or if they needed somebody weird to make a bunch of funny noises, they'd call him in and be like, Warren, you got to come on. That's kind of what I am.
Okay, perfect. So, yeah, it works. I just got the confirmation that it works. So I am happy to announce this episode. We'll be looking into the start of Prussia as a kingdom, and we'll be doing this time with some professional help. But before that, I'll be doing a review of what we talked about so far because it's going to be important. This is one of the really like turning points in Russian history. So we have seen how Brandenburg Prussia starts as a local force of little importance in Northern Europe, and how they have these massive land acquisitions through marriage, and these bring them into a kind of impossible geostrategic position where they kind of struggle with keeping various parts that are kind of disconnected and having to disconnect their lands together, having to connect their lands together. They're completely trashed in the 30 Years' War, and they invent themselves a new coming out of it. And now the Prussia is born. We have a Hobbesian and progressive view of sociology and history promoted by Pufendorf, who will still be alive at the start of this episode in the late or very early 1800s. A Stoic view of leadership imported from the Dutch, where like Stoicism is revived as a philosophy. The militarism is born kind of out of the 30 Years' War, where it's like, okay, we need to have an army, we need to be able to defend ourselves, otherwise people are just going to walk over us. The political focus of the Dutch is imported, so a focus on trade and navies. We have the start of the fast and loose alliance politics that will, in the end the entire thing and have it come crashing down in the First World War. And we also have a start of the political centralization and kind of the march into absolutism. So the first person we'll be talking about today is Frederick the First of Prussia. He is prince from 1688 to 1701 and king from 1701 to 1730. He lives in extreme luxury. He has palaces built, gardens built, royal lions, jesters, and an ensemble of musicians. He starts the Academy of Sciences in Prussia. His best advisor is the court poet Johann von Besser. Johann von Besser's job is that he knows about the various courts in Europe and courtly life in Europe. Oh, Christopher just dropped out. I think he'll be back in a second. And his whole shtick is basically getting kind of elaborate parties set up and that kind of stuff. He to kind of illustrate how just luxuriously Frederick the First lived. In his coronation, Christopher, actually, do you know what thaler is in English, the local currency of Prussia? Because I don't know.
I really don't. In fact, I actually, whenever I was doing this, I had to go do a lot of conversions that I'd never had to do before because when I was reading about, one of the things that really interests me is especially the grain trade between the Baltic and the West that powers so much of this story, and they use a weird weight measurement system called a lasht. and I had to figure
Okay.
out what that meant. I don't.
Yeah.
So the numbers
Okay.
when I talk about money, I this is something that I took from Barbara Tuchman, and she talks about there are too many different monetary systems to keep straight, but they're all relatively about the same. So when you talk about the amount of money, just think of it as a piece of gold, is what it is. So
Yeah.
that's pieces of money is the easiest way to contextualize it.
Yeah, okay, but I just be using the German word Thaler, so we have like a unit. His coronation ceremony, the queen's crown alone, is 300,000 Thaler, which is pretty, which is a lot if you think that the Hohenzollerns earn about 3 million thalers a year. The whole coronation costs around 6 million thalers. It has 30,000 horses on 1,800 wagons. There are a special Lutheran and Calvinist bishops put into office just for the occasion to greet the king, kind of do the ceremony, and just attest to the bi-confessional state of Prussia at the time. And he was also an organizer himself. So you can kind of imagine it in the way where you have like images of Trump that are pretty well known, where he organizes kind of the events at Trump Tower. Frederick the First was kind of the same. He organized his own events. Johann von Besser was, of course, his chief advisor, and in many ways his most important advisor, his right-hand man, because he was kind of the ceremony guy. But Frederick the First was really in depth in the whole like ceremony organization stuff, and he was a very kind and agreeable man. And for maybe many reasons, he's not particularly well remembered by his ancestors, who kind of see him as like a not a great man of history, a wastrel, um, that kind of stuff. So yeah, I don't think I don't know what you think, Christopher. I don't think it's a very fair characterization because even though he kind of played fast and loose with money, he had the dough. He just had the money. It's not like he ran Prussia into a deficit or anything.
Right. I mean, he's just sort of a parvenu, or or like kind of what you would refer to as as new money. But that's a very sort of salient observation because for the rest of Prussia's history, especially with figures like Frederick the Great, this sort of memory of their family as really kind of having been in their own mind kind of backwater trash is very it's very influential when when Frederick decides to become the great cultured king or something like that. He is very much pushing back against his own vision of what his own family was like. So I mean that's an absolutely fair
Oops.
characterization.
Let me just go back. There we go. So something that's also interesting about this Prussian king here is on his ceremony, there are two things that really stand out about his coronation ceremony, and it's really an important milestone in the history. So the crown which he chooses is actually a dome and not a ring. And the dome is supposed to symbolize something that will become kind of a hallmark of Protestant leadership and kind of I had this disagreement with some Protestants before. I know the both of us don't have it, but many Protestants don't like when I say it. That Protestantism inevitably leads to democracy, and I use this as one of my illustrations because the crown he chooses is a dome which is supposed to signalize that he has an all-encompassing power. So he has on his head kind of the dome of heaven, which means he unites the worldly and the spiritual sovereignty. And of course, in Protestantism, the king is both the worldly sovereign and the sovereign over the church. And I talked about this in the very first episode on Prussian history, where I kind of talk about the descent from feudalism into democracy and how you have this stage where first kind of like focuses in on the figure of the king, and the king ceases to be kind of a in the same relationship with God and the country as the middling duke is with his superior and his inferior, where the feudal system is organized in a very interesting way, where you really just have a superior and an inferior, and that is where your world ends. Which is also why feudal princes aren't able to attract women who are like from much lower castes than them. This is something that will change later, where princes will become kind of like very attractive to women from all standing, because now these women are and these princes are actually in the same social circles. But this doesn't exist in feudalism, interestingly. Um, so we have here kind of the necessity of Protestantism that we will see play out through the entire early modern period of the enlightened monarch. I am kind of the summum bonum, the perfect man. I'm a type of Christ, basically, and I have my own church and my own country. And I we will be walking through the history of Prussia, and I'll kind of be pointing out how this kind of inflames the rise of liberalism and the rise of liberal democracy. Somebody who does something like that, although he can't because he's a Catholic, is Louis XIV, Louis XIV, and he, of course, the Roi Soleil. Um, Matthew Jerome writes, if I remember correctly, most Protestants voted for the NSDAP in 1932, whereas Catholics mostly rejected this new movement. That's true. That's true.
Oh,
But
that's a whole different set of worms. I mean, all of this
yeah,
is that all stuff. All of that stuff is sort of the holdover from the Großdeutschland. I'm going to butcher German whenever I don't speak
yeah,
German.
it's okay.
But yeah, but I'll just use the English translation: the Greater Germany versus the Lesser Germany. You know, sort of political. But I mean, the antecedents for it are definitely here. But
Yeah,
that sort of divide gets badly inflamed in the second half of the 19th
yeah.
century is where.
I think I'll be going with this stream right up to Weimar, so we might even be covering this. But yeah, there's a big. I mean, this is of course something Catholics like to point out, and it is true in many ways. Catholicism was very opposed to Nazism, but there's also other things playing into that. For example, the existence of the Central Party, which was kind of the party that Catholics voted for. If you were Catholic, you voted for the Central Party, and you never voted for anything else. So it's kind of a nice point Catholics like to make, but it's not that true. Yeah. But going back to Frederick I, so in his coronation, he kind of makes himself into the enlightened despot almost. And although the kind of ritual and everything like that will not be kept by his predecessors, this aspect of leadership will be kept, and it is in many ways already prefigured in his predecessor, Frederick Wilhelm the Great Elector, who of course also has this kind of stoic view of leadership. And he also coronates himself, which is of course interesting. Kind of like I look forward to Napoleon here, and then his wife. And with this coronation, there's also signaled kind of the exit of women out of politics. So if you guys remember the past streams, women used to be very influential in Prussian politics. This is over now. With Frederick I, women are kind of playing a very much separate role, not just a secondary role, but a separate role. By the time of his son, the whole thing, women aren't really allowed into the court anymore. And then, of course, we get Frederick the Great, who hates women with a passion. So, not looking good for women. And this is something I also want to point out and want to point to, because it's very important. And this is kind of the most important episode in this. It's kind of the changes in the early modern period that will prefigure everything that is going to happen. Because in this, you can see a lot of buds taking place for the future of Europe and what Europe is eventually going to turn into. You can actually already see the suffragette movement. You can see World War I. You can all of that see kind of like the seeds being planted right here in these new ideas and in these new concepts of leadership. And of course, what happens is that in rejecting the female aspect, which Protestantism does, you can see it kind of mystically in rejecting Mary and rejecting her queenship of heaven and kind of degrading her to like an important or probably holy person, and that's it. And this also mystically translates into the rejection of the church, because Mary and the church kind of mystically are the same person, or the same. The church is a type of hers. So in rejecting the church and rejecting Mary, they reject the female element altogether. And you can kind of see this unconnected masculinity building out in Protestantism, going kind of crystallizing in the person of Frederick the Great. Yeah, and
there
yeah, yep.
there are some structural things that you can sort of kind of use to map this progression as it occurs, and how well, again, and it is the most interesting in Prussia. The other kingdom that you can sort of look at and map the rise of liberalism is, of well, I guess if you want to count the Dutch Republic and England are the other two, and they do appear for a time to have, like, especially later on, to have different trajectories of the development of liberalism. But in all cases, the event is the same. One of them is this idea that the first of them is this idea that the authority of heaven comes from, the authority, or the authority to rule the people comes from directly from God, and not through a sort of papal Christendom structure. And this
Hmm.
sets off a nasty set, a potentially nasty set, because it's not always nasty, but there's a cascade of events that sort of start occurring. So now all of a sudden you need this person, the king, to represent what you sort of think your ideal is, and then also at the same time, you will, especially, and this is the part that, because England kind of skipped the 30 Years' War, and
Yeah,
They have an English Civil War that it's roughly analogous, but it does some different things. But one of the main consequences of the 30 Years' War is this idea that the princes and the electors are no longer willing to have power devolved down into smaller feudal structures. Just hard to keep your armies together if if your various vassals and appendages are changing sides on you. So they start pulling they start pulling this, and then you referred to this idea of, well, we're looking at personal representation now, instead of instead of sort of, I don't, characterizing the feudal relationship is a little difficult, but there's a famous theorist, Jürgen Habermas, sort of
hmm,
talks about this, and he's so previously, if a good way to think about it is, if previously, if you're the Margrave of Brandenburg, and we still do this, and when you talk about English aristocrats, you'll still refer to him as Rutland. You're referring to the Duke of Rutland. Well, his real name is like Matthew Jarman or something. His given name is like Matthew, but you always refer to him as Rutland, because the idea is that this person represents the place on it, there's no distinction between this person and the place on the map that
hmm,
is that is their name. Well, the centralization of power starts to really strip these peripheral powers that the aristocracy have, and they start to become, they lose their ability to project the difference between them and other people. And at the same time, this group of people that we're also going to be talking about today sort of rises up, and they tend to be not of an especially aristocratic background. In a lot of cases, don't even have an aristocratic title, and so they're also looking for ways to differentiate themselves from other people. And they develop this idea of civil society, with the king as like a platonic philosopher figure that is to be emulated, with a really elaborate and ornate set of, like, personal rituals and social rituals that we eventually call civil society. And
hmm.
that's the kind of map of the progression that we're following right here, because this is right in the time, in the time tranche where most of this change occurs.
Yeah. So I think like two parting things, or maybe like three parting points on Frederick until we get to his son. The kind of point of the title that he gets, the opportunity for even naming himself a king, because it's actually a huge achievement, which is one of the reasons why I think like characterizing Frederick as kind of like a loose link in the chain isn't really true. He plays the kind of the Prussian power politics and does it really well. There's a struggle going on between France and the HRE. He kind of plays both sides, sees what he can get, and in the end, he gets the title king from the emperor, and the emperor also promises him that he will see to it that other royal houses of Europe also accept the Prussian new title. So that's how he gets it. Of course, he's tremendously happy about it. He throws a huge party, starts the Academy of Sciences. Um, and he lives a very he expands courtly life rapidly. He his court becomes one of the most expensive of Europe. He starts paving the roads, and so on and so forth. I think there's something like really to be said about him personally. I mean, I kind of like pathologizing people of history, and we're going to do it to no end to his grandson. But there's something to be said about his personality that really strikes me because I view Stoics. I was interested in, let's put it like this, I was interested in Stoicism before I became a Christian. It was kind of this philosophy. But there's one thing that always held me back about Stoicism, one thing I always found strange, and that was that Marcus Aurelius, one of the big names in Stoicism, was the last golden emperor of Rome. I was like,
He's
if this,
literally
yeah,
the worst Roman emperor, arguably.
you're that opposed to Marcus Aurelius.
Well, I mean, this is the thing. The problem I have with Stoics, and I'm not real familiar with, Frederick. I don't like to use the word Stoic too much because it has such a potentially variable meaning. Okay, so like, but when you look at who the great Stoics of history are, the people who are remembered as great Stoics, who was that rich Roman guy? Is the other one? I forget his name.
We
He
have
was very wealthy.
Seneca. Seneca.
Yeah, Seneca. Seneca. Okay, now the Seneca is the one I'm talking about. Now,
Yeah.
Stoicism is another one of these philosophies that sort of impels you to give up your worldly possessions or whatever. But then we have the two most famous Stoics, are an emperor of Rome and the richest man in the richest man in the Roman Empire. So it's kind of a do as I say, not as I do sort of thing.
I
But I
mean,
mean,
to be fair, we have a Stoic slave who kind of rises. I
right.
don't know if that even is Seneca, if there's like Epictetus. I've forgotten my Stoicism, to be
I think
honest.
I'm pretty sure it's Seneca. But the problem I sort of have with Aurelius and I think this is the real rub of like taking Stoicism just a little too seriously is because Stoicism is all about reducing your concern about the world to things that are directly within your control.
Mm-hmm.
And arguably the most consequential decision of Marcus Aurelius's entire life is his decision to hand over the. There was no there. I mean, there was some basis for it. There was not much recent basis for the Roman emperor as a hereditary title, and he decides to. He knows his son is not going to do well at this job, and makes
Yeah,
the decision to go ahead and do it anyway. So if you're talking about
yeah,
a philosophy where you concentrate all of your wisdom and all of your learning and all of your thinking on things that are under your control, and then you flub it up that badly, I mean, come on, man.
yeah.
It's not,
And that's the thing. It's the thing I saw with Stoicism. I kind of like when I looked into Stoicism, I looked at Marcus Aurelius and I kind of started to realize, man, I guess he was a good emperor or whatever, but he was a bad dad. I mean, it's not like after the golden emperors, there's like silver emperors or something. It's like, okay, they weren't as great anymore. That's understandable. You know, there are some boots you just can't fill. You just can't all be excellent. No, they were all terrible. Like directly after, like the chain breaks. It's like if he's so like if he has the master philosophy, why is he so terrible? And then I saw that all the people who were advocating for Stoicism, they were all like in their late 20s, early 30s, all of them unmarried, and all of them
oh,
without
this is a
children.
thing. Actually, in
Yeah.
fact, there's currently a movement. It's probably mostly in the United States because this is a very United States sort of thing. But it's mostly in software professionals, and so we're talking late 20s unmarried.
Yeah.
Um, that they're trying to whenever they have to put a religious persuasion down on their on government paperwork and that sort of thing, they to get out of having to, because there are certain rules in the United States about sincerely held religious beliefs, and they put stoicism down as their religion to get out of certain religious to get religious exemptions for certain things. So that's but
Uh-huh.
you nailed the demographic exactly right, and for most
Yeah.
and for the right reasons.
Yeah. So going back to Frederick, why that comes to mind is, of course, is he isn't a Stoic, but his father, Frederick Wilhelm the Great Elector, is a Stoic, and he's very much influenced. That's why I did the recap by a Dutch revival in Stoicism, and he's also probably just a bad dad. I mean, Frederick the First. The book had nothing on like it has the relationship of all father-son couples except for these two, which is kind of frustrating because it actually has like a whole chapter in this, or like a whole sub chapter in this chapter on father-son conflict, because it's also something that's very prominent in the Hohenzollern family. Basically, starting with Georg Wilhelm and going all the way to more or less Wilhelm II. So he is, of course, very different to his father, and I'm guessing that he's also just he didn't really have a dad. I'm guessing his dad was kind of like married to his job and not available to him, very much in the same way in which Marcus Aurelius just did everything right except forgetting to raise a child. So before we go on, Matthew Jerome writes, I think Nietzsche would argue that all Christianity eventually begets democratic values / egalitarianism via slave morality, though I'm sure this critique only really applies to modern Christianity. I think it only really applies to the Christianity that Nietzsche grew up around. I view Nietzsche as a very sincere critic of the contemporary Christianity he lived around, which was completely toothless. And of course, the reason for that is that we are well into modernism, and Catholicism is browbeaten to death. I mean, not to death, but it's like getting beaten up by almost all political bodies in Western Europe, including the French, the oldest daughter of the church, and so it kind of and Protestantism kind of makes the Faustian bargain and allies itself with liberalism, which could also be seen as maybe it growing into its final stage. So Nietzsche was very correct in kind of poking holes into the Christianity of his time, because the only reason who really were Christian at Nietzsche's time, who were people who were kind of like on the lower ends of society, usually the people in the positions of power were Orientalists with occultist leanings. Most of Europe's aristocracy at the time was very much had a very, let's say, philosophical view of Christianity that kind of rationalized it away and subjugated it to other viewpoints that the Old Testament would call the dough of the the dough of the Canaanites, so would forbid as like forbidden cultures. And so he very rightfully criticized it for that, because there was no heroic faith, no saintly faith around Nietzsche at the time that he lived. Okay, so let's go into the second figure, Frederick Wilhelm I of Prussia. So he is the soldier king. He reigns from 100 from 1713 to 1740. He's the polar opposite of his father. He's harsh, rough, and disagreeable. He's like really kind of a caricature of a man's man. He curses, he spits, he is like very unaristocratic in many ways in which he behaves. He wears a soldier's uniform most of the time. This is actually something that all of his children will start doing too. All the Hohenzollern kings will dress in soldiers' uniforms. This becomes part of family culture. He immediately does away with all his father's extravaganza. The book even talks of a cultural revolution. And one of the best examples I found were like the gardens that his father had built for like socializing, probably also to have sex, and that was very usual at the time. They were fashioned into exercise places, and where his father kind of built a great palace that he could look out of and kind of look into the beautiful gardens and see the gardeners do their work. He looked at an exercise place, like soldiers running around doing military exercises. That was his thing. It was also the only place where he kind of did extravaganza was in military affairs. For example, he had like a troop troop put together called the Lange Kerls, and Lange Kerls translates into the long guys, which are like comically large people all put into the military unit. Some of them were so large that they weren't actually able to do any military service, but they were like, that was like his thing, having like large guys in the military with good weapons. And the
Yeah, this is the
country is,
guy. Well,
yeah,
when you're starting to think of like, if you try to think of the most possibly the most stereotypical Prussian that you can imagine, this is the guy. you know.
Yeah, absolutely.
Um, but it is interesting because he's called the Soldier King, and he's very interested in military affairs, but he never
Yeah,
starts a war. This is
true.
he never actually he never starts a war, which is an interesting thing for a militarist.
He really reminds me of like this American phenomenon of the operator guy. I think you know what I'm talking about. Like guys in their like late 30s, early 40s who are like really obsessed with military, and they have like a YouTube channel where they show off like military gadgets, that kind of stuff, and they like
Oh,
talk about military, and they were like they were in the military, but they never got any fighting. They were just like sitting around in like
yeah.
the office in
They
Germany.
ran a, they ran the motor pool for 3 years. Yeah, we call
Exactly.
I call them the tactical crowd. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's a good way to put that.
Yeah, he strikes me as a character like that. Like he has a lot of military fetishism, but he's not really a military man. Well, he's kind of a terrible figure, but we'll get to that. So under him, the country is run by the Tabak Collegium, and the Tabak Collegium is really kind of like the country run by the boys. So this is a very fraternal group. They're like I think 8 to 12 people who they're knowledgeable, incredibly intelligent guys, and they all hang around the king. There's no code of conduct. Everybody just kind of does, kind of behaves in a very rough manner. They spit, they curse, they kind of get into each other's hair. They actually have a guy. I don't know I don't remember the name right now, but they actually have a guy in their group who's financially dependent on his on Frederick Wilhelm I, and he just becomes kind of their bottom boy, I guess you would call it, or like their bullying victim, and they enjoy bullying him all the time. So he has to, like, for example, one of the pranks they played on him was he had to do a talk about the non-existence of ghosts, but he had to drink hard liquor in regular like intervals while giving it. So it was like getting drunker and drunker and drunker while having this talk until he like completely drunk, kind of stumbled off stage and got to rest in his chambers. And there, another guy waited for him, dressed up as a ghost, and kind of gave him the shock of his life. So that guy developed serious alcoholism, and they humiliated him further. They put like a beer keg into his room that was to be his sarcophagus, and they wrote like an exciting poem on it, and to make fun of his drunkenness. And in the end, when he died, they actually buried him in the beer keg, and it was so insulting that actually no bishop or priest wanted to bury him because it was like a disservice to the dead. So they had like one of his enemies at court bury him and write a poem about him. So it's like really, it's like men without women, basically, like men keeping to themselves, being incredibly fraternal.
Right.
It's honestly, it kind of disgusts me.
This is on the other hand, though, because I mean, any American listeners would be like, "Oh, okay, so a college fraternity ran Prussia for for 30 years or so." That's exactly
Yeah,
right.
yeah,
The corresponding structure in Western Europe. I mean, this is a time whenever these single gender spaces start to really increase in prominence, and it's like a very jumped up version of the Dutch and English coffee houses, which were not at all like the coffee houses that you think of today. You know, it's a place where you go and you get absolutely blitzed, and like they call it the Tabac Collegium because they smoked a lot of tobacco. And this is one of these things that I think this phenomenon is not remarked on enough in history. Is what the effect of the sudden access and dependence on these stimulants that are coffee and tobacco are. And so like
Yeah.
that's one thing to sort of also keep in the back of your mind is that these people are, whenever you're sort of thinking about especially the explosive really horizontal growth in ideological systems and political structures that are occurring all throughout Europe. This is in large measure possibly due to some kind of psychosis that's induced by these these dependencies on stimulants. But this is a rambunctious crowd, and one of the things that's interesting is that these are also the things that Americans, and a lot of times, especially contemporary Americans, they look at Prussia, they look at these parts of Prussia, and this is the part that they like. Okay, so
Yeah.
it's the part that that you can romanticize.
And
Back when
again,
the boys could be boys.
yeah, and again, it kind of it displays or it prefigures in many ways, I think, the modern culture. I mean, the term toxic masculinity sadly has taken a life of its own, and of course, being a term that is almost exclusively overseen by activist women, or like women in general, it is also used frequently and even at this point dominantly to criticize real, authentic, and healthy masculinity. But this is what toxic masculinity was made for, and this is what we see more and more and more coming up in Europe. I mean, it's interesting to me that if you look at a medieval court, like the manners, they wouldn't have been there at all. Like the people at a feast, they would have behaved like barbarians. But amongst each other, like towards each other, this kind of behavior we would have never seen in medieval Europe.
No,
It's
yeah,
a completely, yeah.
the courtly behavior, and again, all of this heavy emphasis on the rituals and the habits of a court. These are probably the decline of these is almost certainly, people will try and make this argument that it's not. I have actually never seen an argument from a historian that I agreed with that did not attribute this directly to the growth and spread of Protestantism and what the you know ontological ramifications of it are. Okay, so like anybody who says, "Oh, it's not necessarily Protestantism, didn't cause democracy, didn't cause this," oh, it definitely did. There's no way around it.
Yeah. Um, yeah, here Matthew Jerome says, I believe ancient Germanics held women in high regard in terms of their clairvoyance and social understanding, so much so that one individual in fortune started patriarchy as a Semitic idea. Um, Actually, pretty interesting point. I mean, it's in many ways true. Paganism has this is usually exists in this kind of like double entendre of really, really dismissing and also really, really alleviating women. But this is something that's more for the main channel because kind of like the sexual dynamics, how they play out, how they fracture into one another, and how they interplay with religion is more something I tackle there. But something you also touched on is patriarchy as a Semitic idea, and this is actually a quote that's very interesting. I wrote down from the book about Frederick Wilhelm I on the topic of his conduct with women, because in his case, women are, as I put onto the presentation, women are pushed out of court further, and they're pushed out of court so far that they are um, not allowed at feasts. And one of the observers, one of the aristocrats that are around at the time, actually calls this where is it? A Jewish way of treating women. So this is actually something I haven't heard of. When I think a Jewish way of treating women, then the only thing I know is that there are the so-called Jewish matrons, which are kind of the women who run Jewish households. But apparently, there's also the flip side of that. So very much maybe typical for what is essentially a pagan religion. This kind of like real like autistic separation of men and women, not just in a sense of like appropriateness, don't kind of fall all over each other at every opportunity. But this kind of like keeping away from one another and not even eating with one another at a feast, like not even interacting with one another at a party, which would actually at least explain like many videos I know of Jewish parties where it's just a bunch of men in a room doing like funny dances.
Yeah, and I had never heard this take before. But I was thinking about it, and I'm like, oh, okay, I can see that. The way I've usually formulated it is that I've always said that um, Germanic cultures in particular are, and they have always been far more, I wouldn't say egalitarian, but they have been more reliant on, women interacting in what some cultures would perceive to be masculine, sort of masculine pursuits only. So like women in like saying, it would not be unusual at all for a prince or a king's wife to be an important member of the court. The best example, I guess, is probably
Yes.
Eleanor of Aquitaine, who's formerly
Yes.
French, but as she's as the Queen of England,
I mean,
she's a
Charlemagne
very
too.
yeah, she's very important figure in the politics of the court, and this starts to decline, and of course you could make the argument because this is also when a lot of Jews start showing up, but that's the I would be hesitant to make that exact connection. I would be more willing to say that a lot of the economic shifts that are occurring during this time cause a lot of specialization to occur.
Yeah.
And when women specialize, they tend to specialize in running the household economy. Um,
Yes. I think it's definitely unfair to call this like a Jewish influence because this is kind of like at the foothold where Jews start to gain influence in Europe. We could kind of spin it that way if we say that uh, Protestantism is a way more Semitic influenced version of
that
Christianity.
and that's undoubtedly true. I mean, this is
Yes.
like when the Protestants are always. I mean, there are some Protestants, especially in the United States, that go so far as to refer to themselves as Messianic Jews, and
Yes.
they call their churches synagogues. And
Yeah.
this of course infuriates everyone for their own set of reasons, but that's just that's the Protestantism taken to its extreme. Is
Yeah.
That's where you are.
I mean, there's a chapter in history that I want to put light on, but I don't actually know how to kind of fit it into my content, where Protestants in the United States start becoming like mass Kabbalists and kind of taking Kabbalist lessons, like real like bleeding heart Protestants in the United States in the I think 18th century also start lessons in the Kabbalah to really understand the Bible. Because of course, when you remove your entire like Protestantism lives of removing the old ways of interpreting the Bible, and so the Bible stands for itself, and then you have to find a new way. And so they're looking for something that's more authentic, older. So
Yeah,
they get into Kabbalah and
that's a
start
sort
using
of
that to interpret the Bible. Yeah.
the earliest example that I can think of in American history was at a group of people called the Brook Farm Utopian Collective in the early mid 19th century, but that sort of thing explodes during the Civil War and becomes mainstream for the second half of the 19th century in America.
Yeah. Okay, so it's put some final notes on to our man Frederick Wilhelm the First, and that is that he's a terrible father. He's an absolutely terrible father. I actually read that. I am not actually that read about Frederick the Second right now, so Frederick the Great right now, but I read his fatherhood and I was like, I bet you all my money that Frederick the Second turned gay after that. Because if
Yeah,
you abuse your son that much, he's becoming a homosexual. So I looked it up, Frederick II homosexual, and it's like the first thing I found was like, yeah, he was a flaming homosexual. He hated
yeah,
women. He always spent time around men. He had homosexual art. Everything was like, yeah, of course.
yeah.
So
I'm always hesitant to like sort of cast aspersions. There, really try to psychosexualize historical figures. But this is one case. This is one instance where I'm like, oh, I don't know what you're gonna do with that because yeah, I mean, all of the pieces fit in play, and I mean, and yeah. Frederick Wilhelm, he's the only abusive father is the only thing that I mean. He's like if you imagine like the man who is like it's not quite so bad as kid wants to wear a tutu. He wants his kid to join the army, and his kid wants to wear a tutu and do ballet. It's not quite that bad, but I mean, his approach to the situation sort of entrenched that that aspect of Frederick the Great, and
Yeah.
probably solidified what might have just been a sort of youthful past. In fact, about homosexuality. There's a great quote from a book called Brideshead Revisited, where a it's I think she was a Venetian aristocrat, and she's referring to these two English kids, and of course English public schools are famous for latent homosexuality, and she refers to homosexuality as an English and a German condition they usually grow out of. But if something sort of traumatic happens to you that causes you like this is what I hate my father and this is what I do that makes him angry, so I'm going to keep doing it, kind of entrenches what would have been a kind of a passing fad. Of course, then I just did exactly what I said I don't like doing, and that is like really hyper psychologizing a historical figure without just too much evidence. But the dude was gay.
Yeah. I mean, I would even go so far as to also take this one up with Protestantism, actually, because I can just see the mystical problems with the father, kind of on a mystical scale, where it's like, okay, you have a problem with your papa, with the pontiff, with the papacy, and so this seems to develop into the culture, and as you said, it's like it can be characterized as kind of a German and an English problem, which is interesting also in the sense that for a German, cultures or like a Northern German, throughout recent history, throughout the last 300 years, cultures like Bavaria, France, Spain, Italy, they would have seemed very flamboyant, which is something we also kind of course, equate with homosexuality, right? Yet the countries which have like real homosexuality are actually Germany or like Prussia and Britain. And of course, Prussia, as few people know, will actually become one of the, let's say, birthplaces of homosexual identity in Europe, or of cultural homosexuality in Europe. So, but just to kind of talk about the fatherhood of Frederick Wilhelm I for a bit, yeah, we really have this Frederick the second kind of takes after Frederick the First. So he's more of a bookish person. He likes to read. He likes to be sarcastic with people. He isn't really the straight arrow his father is, and his father kind of in the beginning. There's actually a letter when Frederick is still pretty young, where it's like, yeah, I know that the boy isn't like me, but I don't know what to do. And well, he doesn't know what to do, so he just does whatever comes to mind. And what comes to mind is basically put the boy into the army and drill it out of him. And it has a terrible effect. Frederick II, or Frederick the Great, becomes increasingly resentful of his father. And in the end, he tries to run away. And he has a really good friend, whether or not that friend was a homosexual partner of his. Um, I don't know, but I I assume he was a young man at this point, so I assume that it was already getting into that direction. It's usually the point where it manifests. And but what happens here is that he tries to escape. He's on campaign with his father, and he tries to run away. And sadly, his escape attempt fails, or sadly, I guess is the only word. His escape attempt fails, So he gets put into prison by his own father, where he has nothing. The guard, and this is such a Protestant thing, to be honest. The guards are not allowed to talk to him. The only thing he has is a candlelight and a Bible. So he's supposed to read the Bible, and that's supposed to cure him of his being a disobedient son. And the only thing that the only human interaction he has is that the guards are ordered to ask him a series of like, I think 180 or like 200 questions, which are all kind of like this passive aggressive. Do you think that somebody behaves like that should be kept alive? Stuff. Do you think that somebody who deserts from his father's camp should be the inheritor of a major country in Europe? That kind of stuff. And from his prison cell, he also has to watch the execution of his best friend. And it is the guards actually have to press his face against the prison bars so that he has to look. He can't close his eyes. He can't unsee it. He just has to look at the execution of his friend. And yeah, I think it's I think it's a uh, very sad occasion and very much failure in fatherhood. But out of this hell, you could
This is
say. And after this, huh?
another instance I would also point out that referring to this guy as Frederick's friend that's probably a very sanitized way of putting it.
Yeah, yeah. I said he's probably a homosexual partner, but I'm not sure. Um, so yeah, but out of this prison, which was actually the prison or the tower in which his great or his grandfather, in which Frederick Wilhelm, the Great Elector, was as a child when the 30 Years' War was going on and where he was being educated and held away from court. So out of it comes another great man, this time more or less mostly scarred by his youth. And he kind of adopts the stoic character after that and becomes the Frederick the Great that we all know from history. So let's, having looked at these two figures, let's go into two big changes at the time. And here you also see the Tabak Collegium on the right side, and we're going to talk a bit about the changes in administration. And I think this is where I just have a few notes from the book, and you might be able to supplement my knowledge of history here, Christopher. So Otto Hinze later called this the finalization of absolutism. The book was kind of critical of that and said the state was still small, it was a few hundred people. So it was getting more and more absolutist, but not absolutist in the way and in the Prussian way that we think about, with a giant state structure that's kind of fused with the military and runs everything in an almost planned economy way. I mean, people don't know this, but the empire, the German Empire, ran on a planned economy. So consolidation is done by instantiating central offices. This still happens under Frederick Wilhelm the Great Elector. And these offices oversee military matters, finances, and industry. And then under Frederick Wilhelm I, we see like a massive desire for consolidation and control. And he actually consolidates all of these offices into one central office. And then we have kind of like, so the thing is just called like the Central Bureau or something like that. It has a ridiculously long official name. And they just call it like I think Generalkommissariat, which is like the General Commissariat. And everything is run through that. And there's like a start of kind of bureaucrats being put into place, ministers put into place. In some senses, it made sense, and it definitely increased the gains they had. They kind of cleared up a lot of kind of like misshapen structures within the economy and within their kind of social administration. But you also see, again, kind of the rise of later Europe and the states we live in today, where you have these massive overblown democracies and the managerial revolution, as people talk about it. But the change in administration is fashioned. It's not really something that Prussia develops for itself. It's fashioned after the court of Louis XIV, or Louis the Roi Soleil, and his contrôleur général, Jean-Baptiste Colbert. So they more or less copy French absolutism and try to also create a centrally governed economy, a centrally governed country.
Well, there are a couple of things that are fundamentally different. And I sort of agree with this is definitely the finalization of absolutism.
Okay.
I don't understand how you could. I don't understand how you could really gripe with that characterization, except okay, so the scale of absolutism is different or what. But when you think about if you're trying to arrive, a lot of people conceive absolutism poorly, especially in the United States, and they sort of imagine that this is like they'll think of like the Sun King or something like that. This idea who is gathered, like he becomes the god of the state, and that's it definitely tried to present itself that way, but really what's happening in absolutism is a devolution of power in a lot of ways, because what you're doing is you're taking a number of instances where okay that hereditary aristocracy that in their own time they would have been in charge of the plan of defending the land. They would have been in charge of collecting taxes, redistributing wealth, redistributing grain. And grain is in this part of the world, grain is the most important resource.
Mm-hmm.
And because of the demands of the growing economy, what absolutism really is because now all of a sudden this structure that's called the state exists, whereas it really didn't before.
Mm-hmm.
It has interests, and in Prussia in particular, Prussia famously becomes known as an army that has a state attached to it, and it is if you've ever played a video game, if you ever played Europa Universalis or something like that, and you've tried to, and you've tried to form Prussia, you quickly find out that one of the things is when you start, this land has no economic value whatsoever, and so the resources that the state of Prussia is able to harness to really to feed its army and feed its armies and to continue feeding the people of Western Europe for most of this period, actually between 1600 and 1750 or so. I mean, there's a great book about this called The Mother of All Trades about the Baltic grain trade. But the amount of grain, the fundamental ability of farmers in Western Europe changes relatively little over the course of from the really the 14th to almost the beginning of the 19th century. So when we say the ability to grow this sort of food and this sort of thing, we mean that if for every bushel of seed that's planted, you get about four and a half bushels of food grain, and then you have to save some. You have to put some aside and use it for seed again. But for most of Western Europe, they actually don't. Their population starts to spike, but they don't actually have a way to feed all of their people. So they're continually dependent on these or imports in this case of grain from the Baltic states, and Prussia becomes one of these major producers, and this is the sort of economic catalyst that kind of allows Prussia to start. Well, you have the subsidence of the Swedish state, and then the English win 3 wars against the Dutch and sort of don't eliminate, but they drastically reduce Dutch influence in the area, and so Prussia's able to stand in, and they have this Byzantine network of jurisdictions and trade rights, and they by over the course of the 18th century they consolidate their control over the Baltic. Russia still has quite a bit of it too. Russia and Prussia kind of work together on this, but this ability to export grain into Western Europe is a state function. It is a strategic interest of the state, and they don't trust landed aristocrats enough to do this.
Mm-hmm.
What they start doing is hiring talented bureaucrats whose loyalty they are relatively assured of, and this is a very important aspect of it because they don't want anybody turning turncoat on them. So what's really happening in absolutism is that power is being devolved away from the ancient hereditary aristocracy, and it's being given to this kind of new aristocracy that may or may not actually be aristocrats, but they perform virtually the same function in society, and so that's what absolutism is. So all of the power is theoretically concentrated in the hands of in the person of the monarch, but in reality, he's just he's doling it out to different. He's taking it from the landed aristocrats and giving it to his bureaucrats in the Tabet Collegium or whatever,
Yeah.
and that's what's going on here, and that's the Heinz's take on it. That's exactly right. By the time Frederick becomes king, this is a full blown, really kind of a golden age absolutist state. It may sort of start to be it may sort of be declining by the middle of the 18th century, and it's gone by the French Revolution. So unless you want to think of absolutism as this brief flash in a pan that existed for like 2 seconds and then disappeared, there's not really a way to argue with that with the Heinz take. Yeah, excuse me. Sorry,
Okay.
I'm trying not to use the word take as much.
You cannot run away from it. This is a Zoomer
Yeah.
hosted show. You will relent to the Zoomerisms. Um, yeah, I mean, actually, some things I want to touch on there. What you said, something I just was reminded of was my grandfather on my mother's side. He in his house there's a lot of old, very old items, and they're, I think, mostly one of them is a flintlock pistol. So it's older, or I think about the age, like it's like 200 years old, I suppose, something like that, right? Um, and apparently they're family hand-me-downs. So something I know about my family on my mother's side is they used to be farmers, because the way to the to upstairs is the walls are littered in old farm equipment. And something I find interesting, kind of looking back at it, is I thought this was medieval farm equipment, because it didn't change at all in kind of what it did between the medieval world and kind of the early modern world, and all the way more or less up until industrial farming.
Right.
So, yeah,
The thing
it's
that
just something. Yeah,
the thing that changes is they start importing grain from somewhere else. Is what happens.
commerce starts,
Yeah.
banking starts. I mean, these are the things that are really starting to move Europe. Yeah. Also from the book, there were like some mentions. I think you were way more in depth about it and way more clear about it, because the book kind of skirts around it. Of course, it is a Pantheon book, which are great books. They have massive amounts of sources, and the people who write them are very serious about writing, but they're also suffer from neoliberal bias and not by a small margin. And he also, but the author also mentions how in the eastern parts of the country, Frederick Wilhelm I kind of reconsolidates the land, kind of destroys the feudal structure and the kind of old obligations of the landed aristocracy, and puts new obligations in place. Most importantly, the landed aristocracy now has to pay taxes, and he also changes the tax rates for the farmers. And he actually lowers the tax rates for the farmers for a very simple reason. He thinks that this will increase productivity. So I think it really plays well into what you've been saying just now, where he wants to increase productivity in the East, and also kind of through changing the situation and the interplay with the landed aristocracy in the East. And as we will see in a second, through its military reforms, also kind of making them into more an administrative democracy of a larger state body. He will create just what you talked about, a kind of the new administration, the new administrators for his grain, which he then exports to other parts of the world. Okay, so shall we go over to military affairs, or do you have anything left on administration?
No, that's all I got.
Okay, perfect. That's I don't have much more as well. So military reforms. So Frederick Wilhelm I, being the kind of army boy, that he is increases the military from 40,000 to 80,000 men. This is way more than his country can actually afford. This is ridiculously disproportionate to what his country has in terms of population, in terms of logistics, and
Yeah, well, so for
what?
example, during the city of Danzig it's a city of 65,000 people, and
Yeah,
if it would, and Danzig is actually still formally part of Poland for most of the for I think all the way till the 1790s. But if Danzig is by far the most important city in this part of the world at the time, and to have an army that's the size of the largest city in the area is astonishing and really, and because I mean, it's easy to look at that number and be like, oh, okay, so big. Russia's got 130,000 people on the Ukrainian border right now, and that's not very far from there. This is, this is an astonishingly large army
yeah.
at the time.
Yeah, I think the largest we've heard about with Prussia, I think, was in the last time Frederick Wilhelm the Great Elector during the 30 Years' War. I think he went all the way up to 40,000, and I think this was a ceiling which he held for like 2 years during the or after the 30 during the war against the Swedish. I think.
Yeah, I mean, you can't keep that kind of army in the field for very
Yeah.
long, unless, like I was just talking about it a minute ago, you have very bureaucratized and militarized, state economy. Like this, you
Yes.
have to do those things to be able to support an
Yes.
army this size.
Yes, and here again we kind of see the modernity knocking. This is the First World War knocking, because this is the kind of logistics. This is the kind of, just as you said, the kind of militarized and centralized state that you need to run a First World War campaign. And of course, all the countries in Europe will turn into this, except maybe uh, to a lesser degree Austria-Hungary, but all of the other ones will, which is of course why people say, "Oh, Austria-Hungary was just about to fall," which is completely ridiculous. Um, but yeah, you have kind of the birth, I think, of the machine man in this in many ways. So he also tries to do forced recruitment or forced drafting of the soldiers. I didn't really know how to translate it. Kind of forced draft, and of course, it didn't work. He had these officers running around who were like very rude people who would just like walk up to tall young men and say, "You're in the army now." And, well, it was a terrible idea. Boys, of course, refused en masse. The people were hated. It wasn't. I mean, it wasn't that common, but also wasn't uncommon for recruits to die in trying to not be recruited. So he gave away to the canton system. And I only know the German word, but this is kind of what an early version of Wehrdienst, which is kind of where you have to um, serve in the army for when you hit a certain age. You have to finish your basic training, and after that, you get released back into society, and you have to come back regularly to refresh your training. Do you know how that's called in English?
Oh, and we would mostly just we would call it forced conscription, but there, I mean, well, it impressment is the word we would use for the previous phenomenon that you were talking about going to people's houses but England has never done this. Okay, that's like we don't have a in the Anglo-American world we don't really have a corresponding idea. This is one of the things that makes English liberalism, English political theory. It's one of the things that separates us from continental systems. Is we never did corvée labor never happened in England, and then in French, I would guess you would call it the levy en masse. That never happened in England until World War One. It did in World War One, but that's almost that the game is broken by then, and nobody is playing according to their own classical rules. But we don't. We would just use the German word actually. So whenever we talk about it, we say the canton system.
Ah, okay. I mean, in Germany, nobody uses the word canton system.
Yeah.
We would use Wehrpflicht, which is kind of the obligation to defense,
Yeah, no,
or the
there's
duty of defense.
I can't in it I could, the way English people would do that is write a poem about it. Um, that's that's the only thing I can. We don't have that ability to just convey complex ideas in one word that Germans do.
And I feel flattered on the behalf of Germans out there. But yeah, something that's also part of the canton system is that all the aristocratic families have to hand in a list or have to be put on a list with their children. So the state knows when the children hit the age between 12 and 18, and then they draft the boys into the officer corps, where they will be educated in Berlin on what it is to be an officer, a military officer, and that way they kind of give or usually or not uncommonly, let's put it that way, they recruit them into the army afterwards. So we already talked a lot about absolutism, and this is just another prime example of kind of the breaking up of the feudal system. It's kind of an almost mocking way of kind of repurposing the old system of knights and lords and kind of giving your son into a pagehood at another lord's house or even at the king's house, and seeing him grow into a knight, into a fighter, right? And this is kind of your son being drafted into the central military body and becoming a kind of military aristocrat. And of
Well, the
course,
king, the king is the only legitimate source of power anymore. So the only
yeah,
person you can give your son to is the king, and you know
yes,
the king has everybody's son, so he needs to hire a bureaucracy to make it run. You know, he needs to hire people to take care of your kids. So he's got to take
yeah,
your kids to take care of your kids.
yeah, exactly. And it's a great quote. And so yeah, this will of course go on and kind of build into this absolutist Prussian militarism. By the 1720s, the book mentions every royal family had at least one son in the officer corps. It's not every royal family, but basically every royal family. So, and it again, just a refashioning of the aristocracy. It worked because the aristocracy was divided and, of course, had like layers upon layers within itself, and the king was kind of a constant force applied to it. So, for example, people would kind of start dropping out at the bottom. Well, they can send their sons to military school, and now they actually have a good income, and they like become like bureaucrats, like lifelong bureaucrats, right? So it's like over time and through the force applied and through the already central power the king had, which Frederick Wilhelm the First, of course, Frederick Wilhelm the Great Elector, of course, kind of bestowed upon the family. And in his case, we can still speak of kind of like an earnest attempt to kind of get the country on track, because it was kind of like the obligations and the relations were kind of overgrown. The monarch didn't really have much power, or the sovereign didn't really have much power over the country. It was mostly in the state hands. There was no like real separation of boundaries of, well, is this ruled over by the estates and like the house of the estates, or this is ruled over by the duke. And this kind of had Prussia be more or less disorganized aristocracy, we can say that. But in Frederick William I's case, this is really just power and control and centralization. It's like, yeah, I want to have everything in this country in my hand. You have no right to object to that, and you will now be refashioned into just a well-educated, well-trained set of bureaucrats that will run everything for me. And I think in looking at absolutism this way, we can also really see how absolutism fashions the way not only to later Europe, for example, to the German Empire, which, as I just mentioned previously, is run by a planned economy and, of course, a military, but also, for example, to communism, which, of course, when you have the planned economy thing, all you need to do is all you need to apply to that is basically hatred of the family structure, and you get to communism, right? So this again, I think this is the time. This is kind of the jumping point. This is where modern Europe rears its head, and I would even say that this is where the early modern period is over and where the modern period starts. Even though historically it will still be called the early modern period for quite a while. Um, yeah, and as I mentioned previously, military was Friedrich Wilhelm's the first highest point of pride and the only area of life in which he matched the spending habits of his father. He ridiculously overspent on military matters. But again, the Hohenzollerns at this point, they were quite a wealthy family. The time of being a more or less impoverished or not that influential and not that wealthy family in the northern HRE is are long over. They are now very, very wealthy, including from the grain trade, as Christopher just explained. So they can afford spending like that, even if it's more or less for a massive prestige project. Okay. Do you have anything to add on the military reforms, on the absolutism?
No, no. I want to see where you go next. I have something that it really pushes past military reforms and makes a more general
Okay,
commentary.
I
So
mean,
I'll save it.
the next slide is actually the last slide in the presentation. It's just kind of like a
Okay,
catch all for the future. So
right
we can talk about it after that or before that. When do you want to?
there we go.
Where do you want to
Let's
go?
I'll use it in the end.
Okay, it's just finish out the presentation, and then we'll talk about a bit of the rest of it. If yeah, and then we'll just get to the end of the stream. So the legacy. So from now on, the book really makes a point of this. The Hohenzollerns will be characterized by a father-son conflict, with descendants falling somewhere between Frederick I and Frederick Wilhelm I. So more on the flamboyant, kind of outgoing, non-militaristic side, to all the way to the soldier king, with both Frederick I and Frederick Wilhelm I kind of giving the two extremes. The one having the most expensive, or one of the most expensive courts of Europe at the time, which was a lot considering how France was at the same time, where Versailles was, I think, already built. And Frederick Wilhelm I, of course, being this ridiculously, possibly compensating military man. But it's also something, again, where I think it's kind of, it has to do with the Protestant identity in many ways, kind of the mystical rejection of fatherhood, of the father's inheritance, of the father's guidance, because the father isn't perfect. And if the father isn't perfect, if the father isn't basically Christ incarnate and God, then I don't have him. Like, this is, I think, even plays into the American spirit and what happens with the Americas. I mean, you can see it, I think, play out in the Americas in many ways throughout different generations, where American generations reject each other, reject the fatherhood of one another. I mean, most prominently, of course, the 60s with the slogan, "Trust nobody over 30," rejecting their fathers outright. Um, but in many other areas as well, it's a kind of the interplay that you see with the Hohenzollerns, I think, is something that is observed not just in this family but all over the place, and that is that they kind of always compensate for one another. Usually, it's like kind of like flamboyant or outgoing, whatever you want to call it, militaristic, outgoing, militaristic, and so everybody takes after his grandfather and is in conflict with his father. And instead of kind of continuing a family line, they just continue a political legacy. It's the legacy that Frederick Wilhelm the Great Elector gives in his final speech, on his final note at his death, about Prussia having to remember its history during the 30 Years' War, and having to act accordingly, and having to expand itself, and having to save its place in Europe. And they all follow that. They all expand the land. They all play the fast and loose politics. They're good at that, but they're not a good family, and they don't really have a family culture, which is kind of sad, to be honest. Of course, Frederick Wilhelm I's son will become the Great Frederick II, also simply known as Frederick the Great. And he will probably not be the topic of next video, because the book kind of does a detour and focuses in on various other things about Prussian culture and Prussian history. And I think all of them are interesting, because what this series is at the end is kind of like a looking back at Germany, kind of like looking at, well, where did things go wrong, to kind of give Germany, or to kind of hopefully develop a bit of look into the future from that. And so I'm very much interested in doing the other parts as well. The next part will probably be about Protestantism in Germany in even more depth and detail. Okay, I think that's as much as I kind of have surmised from this chapter of the book. So we can just like talk freely about loose hanging threads and other things you wanted to mention, Christopher. So what do you have for me?
Well, the only thing I really had, and it sort of goes to the, we've seen this sort of happen twice now. We're gonna see it happen again, in I don't know, maybe one or two episodes when Prussia is totally destroyed at the Battle of Leipzig. For a militaristic culture, um, they lose. They've got this very invincible reputation that is derived largely ex post facto. They lost a lot of wars, but one of the things that characterizes the Prussian state, and from an external perspective, during the late 17th century to the end of the 18th century, is the idea of Prussia as, I don't know if you're familiar with the equities trading concept of a Krondatiev wave, which is this it's this idea is an idea a Russian economist came up with a long time ago, that there's there are roughly 30 to 60-year cycles in economic phenomenon. So like I don't know, what I can't think of a good example of a Krondatiev wave, but Prussia starts to sort of take, it gets the reputation as sort of behaving this way, and this is something that's not going to change until really Prussia is finally abolished as one of the Allied peace conditions at the end of World War II. I mean, if you're familiar with, like, you think, oh, we look at Prussia on a map, and there's nothing there. Almost none of the land that was considered Prussia is today a part of Germany, and the ancient capital in Königsberg was, the United States explicitly allowed the USSR to keep it, because it was by 1942 it was a verifiable peace, victory condition of the Allied powers that Prussia cannot be allowed to continue existing, and it's because of this kind of Krondatiev wave reputation that it gets. And sort of what happens is Prussia is beaten badly. It's not really beaten, but it's devastated by the 30 Years' War, and it decides to build itself back up, and it goes never again, and it hyper militarizes itself in order to do this. And the cycle that Prussia kind of enters is that it will suffer a catastrophic defeat, then it will badly overcompensate by spending everything on its military to rebuild, and then it will go on a Revanchist tear and start gobbling up huge chunks of Europe. And this is the reputation that it acquires internationally, especially amongst the other European countries, as a disruptive new modern power. And so this is one of these very interesting things also, that we tend to think of Prussia as reactionary in a lot, but it's actually one of the most hyper modern, hyper liberal states that you can imagine, and
Yes.
it terrified the rest of the old world. And later on, it terrified the United States as well. After the United States falls out of United States and Prussia sort of fall out with one another, but the idea that, if you're thinking about Prussia, you sort of have to think of it not as a stable state structure at all. It tries to mime a stable state structure, but it tends to shoot up like a rocket and then lose everything and then rebuild and then shoot up like a rocket again, and have the same thing happen to it over and over again. And this is one of the reasons the Allied condition was that Prussia doesn't happen again, was because they were afraid that they were going to go start a third world war.
I mean, there's so much in there. So let's think a bit apart. So that's very true. I think one of the things I really want to stress in this show is that we have a view of Prussia and of the German Empire that is completely manufactured by English and American propaganda, whereas this is kind of the conservative state. And then you see in Germans, and this is also why I try to do this thing. It's like oh, in German conservatives, oh, we need to go back to Germany when it was conservative. We need to go back to Prussia. We need to go back to the empire, right? And it's like, no, don't do it. This is the most liberal state of Europe, like, most of the time. This is where a lot of European liberalism is actually born. I mean, Kant, Hegel, those weren't
Yeah.
starch conservatives. Like, this is where communism comes from. We were the birthplace of communism. This
Yeah,
is
I
not a
was say, but
coincidence.
I'm pretty sure
Yeah,
Marx was born in Prussia too.
yeah,
And that's
and and I think something is that's also interesting is that um, what you mentioned about this like massive rise and fall. I think German history, although like this is like a very like unique take, but I personally, and this might just be because I'm a huge fan of German and Chinese history, but German history is very much copied of, or like not copied. What am I saying? It kind of reminds me a lot of Chinese history. Just that in the German case, the Germany kind of is strong, then gets beaten up on, then it's strong again, then it gets beaten up on again. When China, of course, it's strong in the world, and this is another parallel. Kind of Europe revolves around Germany, right?
right.
Just because
Yeah.
geographically it's at the center. And China, of course, has the idea. I mean, it calls itself Zhongguo, the land of the middle, and it has this idea. It's even a theological idea that the world revolves around China. This is part of Chinese state religion. The king is actually identified as the place of Shangdi on earth, and Shangdi is the supreme ultimate, the kind of god in Chinese, which they still have from the Bronze Age, where you have this conception of God that I mentioned in the main series already, of a central axle of a wheel, and all of it revolves kind of around God. And the Chinese have this conception of God, and they have this conception that they are the placeholder of that in the world. So they believe themselves to kind of that the world really revolves around them. And Germany is in many ways the same. Kind of because it is at the center of Europe, it sees the world as revolving around itself politically, and it's not wrong because, well, it is there, it is at the center, and that is why it does these like fast and loose power politics, which more often than not kind of come to bite it in the end and come to have everything crashing down around it. So I think there's definitely kind of a parallel in history there. And I think, oh yeah, I was offered a job actually a few years back, which basically, so this guy was coming up to me, and he was a Chinese guy, and he was like, "I have a job for you. You do sales, right?" And I was doing sales at the time, and I was like, "Yeah, I do sales." Actually, met at a conference that was hosted by my university, and he said, "Well, I have the startup in China. We make 500,000 a year, like 1.5 million a year, I think, with if you count it in state subsidies." And we do robotics, and we want to go into Germany. I'm like, okay, sounds good. And he says, oh, the Chinese, they like the German way of doing things a lot. So what your job would be to make connections with German universities, and to kind of arrange that Chinese people can visit German universities and the German production facilities, so we can learn about how German engineering works. And it's like, okay, it's industrial espionage.
Right. Yeah.
uh, and it was basically the job. He kind of sugarcoated it, but I was like, yeah, it was basically an industrial espionage job, and so I didn't want to take it. I kind of like in the end, I just thought about it and was like, yeah, but I mean, Germany is also a bit of a fruit fly in many ways. And this was exactly what you were talking about. Like, we explode onto the scene, then we're unstoppable, and everybody writes praise and songs about us and goes, "Oh my God, these Germans! Just look at them." And then we're just getting completely like our face kicked in, like a frat boy who's been like having too much fun around the others. And then everybody's like, oh my God, look at the stupid Germans. They can't get anything done. So, and of course, China seems to develop in the same way, which I find interesting, where they had
Yeah.
these massive expansion recently. And now, I mean, is there anybody who really thinks that China is going to be the country of the future? I mean, come on.
Right. It's yeah, similar concept, but much faster, much
Yeah.
tighter wave cycles. Like this, I mean, it'll do it like doom doom like from the first time. So from 1650, how many times has this happened? So okay, so they do so one, two, three, four times at least. Well, then if you count World War I and World War II as separate issues, but that's it happens a lot in
Yeah.
Germany.
Okay. So it's we have a few comments, mostly by Matthew Jerome. Uh, Tangentially reminds me of the terrible news articles that claim Mustache Man was a homosexual, had a fetish for brown things. The psychosexualization of historical figures can be outlandish sometimes. Have you ever heard that Mustache Man was a homosexual who had a fetish for brown things?
I've heard that, but I've heard him accused of everything, and like I've heard him accused of being like hypersexual with the Mitford sisters, of course, and then of also being gay, and
Uh,
then of also being impotent or whatever. It's just out.
I mean, yeah, I think, and this is one of the reasons I don't want to cover him and his time. It's like it's too recent
Yeah,
history, and it's still our current society defines itself against him too much. So everything that we do nowadays will just mirror onto him and onto his time in history, and he will constantly change. So I'm
and I
not
do
really
think
interested in doing him because it just you get your fingers burned.
this other comment that Hitler's National Socialist State's an extension of that Prussian explosion and then destruction. It kind of is and it isn't, because Hitler's not what you would call pro-Prussian in
Yeah, can
any
you
mi-
please refer to him as Mustache Man because I don't want to be YouTubed.
Oh yeah, I forgot this is YouTube.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's not an especially pro-Prussian individual, but he does sort of rip the face off that Prussian militaristic culture and wear it as a skin suit, and
Yeah.
till about 1942, and then sort of the party functionaries started to really um, move old Prussian hands out. But yeah, so it's an extension of the phenomenon. But if anything, it's the the burnt out end of that
Yeah.
of the ability of Germany to keep doing this over and over again, because he breaks most of the infrastructure in the process.
I mean, I have a deep belief that within the wisdom of the crowd, within kind of the common consciousness, this is a Jungian inherited belief, but within the common consciousness, there is a certain uh, condensed down vision of the future. This is also something I ascribe to artists. I see, for example, in the development of Russian art, the entire history of the Soviet Union already playing out before the communist revolution even started.
Yeah, yeah,
And you can see it, I think, in the mid-century Germans. They show a lot of signs of a death cult, and a lot of their a lot of their processes and their celebrations and their mysticism. It points to a death of the European people and of the German people. And of course, it's kind of like the idea of this final charge of the German people. Either we make it or we break. And I
yeah,
think we are actually post this transition. And again, this is kind of why I'm doing this thing here. Is okay. The Prussian history, it failed, and with them it really failed. That they really they took it seriously. I mean, you say he wore it as a skin suit, but in many ways, he took it more seriously than most people before him. He really believed in the Prussian
right,
military spirit, way
right,
more than others.
and in
And
and in
he
and in
put everything
Wagner.
on this map. And after
Yeah,
that, Germany's over. And I think a lot of people think that, oh, the Germany after the war, that is kind of Germany constructed by the Americans, and it's not, doesn't have anything to do with its history anymore. And I think, no, actually, Germany still, like the part of Germany that we have to get rid of still needs to be rid of, but it's something authentically German. The only things the Americans stripped away was kind of German military culture, and they did implement some parts but most of the parts Germany was already receptive to, like the idea that the German 60s are just a pure American import. It's kind of a misunderstanding of history. This is a very German thing. I would go. You can even see it insofar as, for example, the German Green Movement. Right? They
Yeah.
inspired the American Green Movement, not the other way around.
You're
The
talking about
Germans were the huh?
what is the fellow's name? Geert Bastian was his the he was a Lufthansa general. Was that he was the founded the German Green Party?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, it's my personal because and this is why again what I want to say how Prussia is actually a liberal state, and I think it is my personal opinion that Germany, if it wants to look at its history, and this is actually the thing I want to do after this stream, I want to look at the history of the German. I don't know if you're interested in doing that. Interested of the German Empire, the HOE, and I'll probably also even do a stream on Bronze Age Germany, where we actually had a very short-lived Bronze Age Empire, kind of playing into the German character again. It rose to prominence incredibly quickly. It was actually probably one of the most dominant states at its time, and then just collapses and vanishes, and we just had very little, like a very short time frame of historical evidence for it.
I am down to do that actually. I have never done a stream with a German before. I've done shows with Finns, with a lot of French people, Italians, but I have never. I'm always trying to collect different countries in Europe that I've done shows with, and then this is you're my first German, and found it way more pleasant and easy than I anticipated it was going to be.
Yeah, you see, you're also kind of trapped by American and English propaganda of how Germans behave.
Well,
So
yeah.
let's get to some of the other comments. I missed Monarch just says very cool ST. Thank you, Mo. Shout out to you. He's one of my IRL friends. Matthew Jerome says the idea of a state attached to military is a base take if I've ever heard one. I'm writing a book on sociology. I think it's the only thing I want to say there. I mean, a lot of people said to me, "You're pretty young to write a book," but I want to write a book about sociology, and I think I want to pass on whether or not a state being attached to a military is a good thing or not until I'm finished with that book. Do you have anything to say? Is a state being attached to a military based or not based?
Well, I mean, this is where sort of where my latent Americanism comes in, and that's like that sort of thing frightened us so much. There are two separate amendments to our Constitution that were devised explicitly so we couldn't become that, and then we did anyway. So it's one of those things. It's kind of hard to stop. But Prussia is the earliest and best example of it. And they definitely they took it to the most extreme. Where I mean, and that's like where this is the idea that the Prussian state exists only to keep the Prussian army in the field, and that's Frederick's Prussia. If
Yeah.
this guy is always. I've actually never done a stream where we talked about Frederick the Great without talking about any of his military victories. That's actually an impressive achievement.
Okay, so I think also Masterschmann's mid-century German state is an extension of that Prussian explosion and destruction. Yeah, I think we talked about that before. I think we both agree. It's like it's just doing the whole thing all over again, rising, falling, like rising, overdoing it, overcompensating, getting your face beat in, and then falling. Or is there anything I think you had like some reservations there actually.
Well, yeah, just a little, but I already talked about him.
Yeah, I think. Okay. So then also Matthew Jerome, for a state to exist in cycles, that reminds me also of the Kali Yuga cycle, or in the Aryan tradition of the idea of civilization cycles. I hope you've seen my procession cycles video. I think this is where I kind of go on to the cyclical character of history too. And I am a fan of these kind of conceptualizations if you take them in a, let's say, inappropriate form. I think a lot of these things are very real things. And I think they need to have a place within Christianity. And I think not providing them a proper place is one of the reasons why Christianity fell out of favor with aristocrats, because even though they're, let's say, not really that important to everyday people, kind of having a mesh between a cyclical and linear view of history is something that's very important for an aristocrat who, of course, is interested in kind of maintaining his standing and maintaining his power. And even though Christianity actually has answers for that, for example, in Ecclesiastes, these concepts are baked in. They're often not really that stressed. And so when you have these kind of Eastern ideas of, oh, the Kali Yuga, usually prepared and meshed up for you by figures like one of the people, one of my highest people of dislike, Evola, then this, of course, finds a lot of fans in more aristocratic circles. Even though I think Evola was never really read by any aristocrats, he was already too late for that.
Yeah.
Um,
Called himself a
yeah.
baron, but he wasn't a baron. That's
To
one
be
of
fair, he didn't call himself a baron. He was just
no,
called a
see,
baron by others.
somebody else. Yeah, somebody else did. Yeah,
Yeah.
no, the cyclical stuff. Got to be careful because I mean that's you're getting into like Helena Blavatsky's. That's the real problem I have with it is that it does, especially if it's taken in an idealistic or in any sort of spiritual sense as an absolute truth. You I have to remember the well, and this will show you how Protestant I actually am, is that Christianity to me is a linear narrative has to have a linear narrative, or a linear narrative of history. I don't see how
Yes.
it doesn't. So you gotta be
So
careful with that stuff.
let's talk about that for a bit. I think we can like, round out the 2 hours. I think that's okay. I think that's still YouTube length. I hope I hope people will still watch this. But we have good viewership numbers for my channel. We have 3 people watching. I'm very happy. Uh, so I mean, the first thing is that Christianity is a religion uh, that breaks the arrestation of the world. And this is actually, there's not few historians who notice that countries before Christianity or anything resembling Christianity seem to be suspended in time. You have these tribes in Northern America, for example, these native tribes, and they have stories about how they traveled to Northern America 10,000 years ago. And those stories are actually legit. So you can actually trace them and say, oh, yeah, they actually were there. We have archaeological evidence of that and everything. So on the one hand, that seems remarkable, right? But on the other hand, that works because they have been essentially been suspended in time for those 10,000 years. They have been basically living the same life for 10,000 years. And Christianity kind of breaks with that. It kind of, it is, and a lot of people, especially on the right, kind of want to speak against that and say, no, Christianity isn't a progressive religion. But it's like, well, it's not a progressive religion in the way in which the term progressive is being used today, but it is a religion that constantly develops. I mean, in Catholicism, we have this view of the development of scripture. And development means that you have something that's enveloped, and then you open it up and it kind of unfolds. I mean, you can even see as much, and as troubled as my relationship with Hegel is, let's put it that way, because I don't actually hate the man or his philosophy that much. I just think it's kind of over-engineered and autistic and kind of collapses because of that. Kind of like a tiger tank. But he has this idea of the unfolding of history, and this is something that for a Catholic is actually not that bad of an idea, because our idea of the unfolding of Catholicism is actually not that different. We have an idea that nothing ever gets corrected, so we wouldn't say, oh, that teaching that the Pope had in the 8th century, that's outdated now. You know, it's like, this is, of course, something a lot of people fear about Catholicism, right? That the Pope goes, oh, you know what? Like the whole no female bishops thing, that's so outdated. That's so that's so sexist. Let's just not do that, and let's do female bishops. That's way more inclusive. That's never going to happen. But what is going to happen is that Catholicism becomes more and deeper understood. And that is a process we're just continually a part of. And which is also why, for example, the Pope seems to so many people so progressive and so much married to this modern progressive world, and why they have these fears is because he wants to push this forward. And of course, there has been ever since the First Vatican Council with a lot of people been the development of them caring more for Catholic culture than for the core of Catholicism itself, for the kind of the driving essence, the driving nature from which we develop our theology, from which we develop our religion, from which we develop out kind of our outlook into the future. And so they kind of clamor to this old Catholicism, and sometimes it can be. I mean, I'm not trying to really drag on the traditional Catholics here. I was with a friend for the last 2 months, and we were at an FSSP parish. So not the schismatics, I think it's the FSSP in English, yeah. Um, and there were great people there, absolutely. And there are just also just cultural counts in there that are completely legit, but often borders on people who just want to be part of the Catholic past. And this is something the church cannot accept. So we definitely have this linear look into history where we progress, where we develop. But we also have to um, take account of the kind of the rhythm of history. I mean, some people say history doesn't repeat, but it often rhymes. I think that's kind of a bad way, because just because history repeats doesn't mean that it can't be linear. And this is
Yeah.
exactly what the procession cycles video, of course, calls out. So if you watch it, you see how kind of the linearity and the cyclical nature kind of sync up, and you have a rhythm attached to history of a rise, flourishing, and decline of empires that generates further and further and further, and kind of still also develops into the future. But this is something that only can take place actually with something like Christianity. And everything that has been able to provide something similar in the past has usually been very, let's say, preparation for Christianity. So, for example, you in China, you see something of a linear development of history, even though they still kind of are, for the most part, arrested in time, and that their linear development of history is under Confucianism. So you might say, well, there's something like that which isn't Christianity. But then, of course, once the Christians arrive there, all the Confucians basically say, oh, yeah, we're
Yeah.
talking about the same thing here.
They immediately recognize one another as
Yes.
having a similar basis. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Aside from the Kulaya says, aside from the China parallel, there's the obvious Japan one. Both exploded with bloody, in every sense, success. Both got their military traditions defanged by Americans. What do you think about that parallel, Christopher?
I think we talked a little bit about the defanging. Japan is interesting because Japan is almost like America, and it's especially the post Meiji Restoration. Japan is sort of like the uh, child of a marriage of American and Prussian political economy. So it is, these are actually three. If you could build a triangle out of the three, then Japan is the one that links the two. And if what happens after World War II is that Prussia is, the Prussian aspects of it again are totally removed. Like, so there were, very similar economic concepts that were like, in fact, actually, people talk about the German miracle in the 1930s, or or something. If you want to see where that concept was applied most effectively, it's, I mean, the explosive growth in Japan dwarfed even the growth in Germany and in the UK, where they were both very profound. At the end of World War II, the United States went in and said, "Yeah, all that German stuff you're doing, you're not going to do that anymore. Here's a, you know, here's a quote unquote free market. You know, uh, you
I mean,
by the way,
I
you can only buy debt from us now. That's the rule. Yeah, but
I
that's what we
mean,
did.
Japan is a country that is actually the one of the ground zeros for just how influential, how powerful central banking can be, because the way they did it, of course, and they're still more or less in the process of doing it and remodeling Japan into a United States style economy was through the central bank, through massively inflating the Japanese market, through basically loaning out money to every idiot that came along, and then just stopping the loans. And then, of course, the Japanese economy crashed, and it had to be remodeled by expert economists into a United States economy, which was, of course, in each and every
Ex-
way superior.
Expert economists from the University of Chicago. It's
Yeah.
always the University of Chicago.
I mean, they weren't Americans. They were Japanese people trained at the
Yeah,
University of Chicago because, of course, they were Japanese people who got the best available education.
right. Well, that's what we did
Uh,
in the other famous country we did that in is Chile. You know,
yeah,
they called those Chilean economists the Chicago boys. I mean, that's like
yeah.
it's just
I
it's just
have a
all
friend who owns vineyards in Chile. So yeah, I mean, I might get him on, but he's not that good with history and economics. Actually, he's more just like good with wine.
I
Might do a
wish
wine episode.
I'm sort of jealous actually. I wish I knew more about wine than I did about history.
He also has. Let's talk about that off stream.
Yeah.
Uh, yeah, I mean, I could totally do an episode about wine. Could invite some people and talk about wine together. Why not? Um, but yeah, I mean, considering Japan, I mean, something that, let's say, is very different from this characterization is, of course, that Japan had the Edo period. I think it was 200 years of stability and peace. Um, this is something that Germany never had in no form. This is something that is only afforded to an island nation. You might say England had something like that.
Yeah.
Um, I mean, it wasn't really stability and peace, but it was they were being left alone, so that's good enough. uh, and I mean, I don't know. I think the proclivity is there because Germany and Japan were allies in World War II. So there's kind of a proclivity to kind of show, like, equate them to one another. And something that's also similar is the Japanese cult of the emperor and the German cult of the Führer. They were very similar. With the emperor, of course, being this solar deity, this chosen of Amaterasu, or I don't even know how that went. I actually have a friend who was right now writing a PhD thesis about the emperorship of and the cult of Japan, the emperor cult of Japan. Maybe I'll hit him up and do a
I mean,
Japanese episode. Who
if
knows?
if I'm not mistaken, because the in the Meiji Restoration they imported as much as they could of the German attitude towards their sovereign. Like that's the template that they used.
Yeah, yeah,
If I remember properly, yeah.
I
I
think
like
so. Yeah.
Asian history though is like the stuff that I know. The Asian history is stuff that I mean basically the only Asian history I know is I mean because you mentioned Germany and Chinese histories. I read a book by Jürgen Osterhammel, who's I think is the most brilliant living German historian, called "The Transformation of the World." It's a global history of the 19th century, and he's formally a historian of China, and so he focuses on China a lot. That's the only thing I really know about Asia. I call it the Orient.
Okay. Yeah. And I mean, something that's also very different between Germany and Asia is Germany is a land power, and not Germany and Asia, so Germany and Japan. Germany is a land-based power. Japan is a navy-based power. or the Japanese Empire as a navy-based power. I don't know. I think there is a parallel in how Japan also kind of behaved during its later history after the Meiji Restoration, how it rose again, and has since fallen again in more economic terms. And there is, of course, the high cultural regards the Japanese have for the Germans, which is probably also kind of laundered through American culture. Because if you look at like Japanese anime depictions of German people, it's usually also the American stereotype, and then Germans consume that and take it as a kind of template for what they are or used to be, and then you just get like Baudrillard written all over it, and
Well,
he's going to
there are some fascinating parallels that Germans and Japanese people tend to be
yeah
very good at making the same obscure stuff. So, like for
yeah
instance, if you take like razor blades that you use to shave your face, and I don't mean like the disposable ones, and I also don't mean the cartridge that you hold these things in. I mean just the blade itself. To the two countries, I mean the two companies that make the two best one. One's German and the other's Japanese. It's like I don't know why that
yeah
worked out, but it did.
we Germans produce a lot of high-end niche products. We are, I think, 50% of the exports, for example, of medical hand equipment. So like the stuff your what do they call it, dentist uses to kind of work manually on your teeth, for example. It's, I think, 50% of that is produced in a little village in Germany. And that's like other obscures like construction stuff and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Andrew Camus says, I have 50 books that says Sandbadge is a crypto German idealist. Sandbadge, how can you justify yourself?
Oh
Will you
Lord,
take the slander laying down?
I'm being trolled. That's an esoteric academic agent reference. Is what that
Okay, Camus
is.
also writes, besides Rusty Vignettes and the Grateful Dead, what does Sandbadge listen to?
Oh no, that's. I actually listened to a lot of Bach this morning.
Oh,
Uh,
nice. Getting ready for the stream,
yeah,
getting yourself into the mood. Yeah. I think, if I'm not mistaken, the old intro was a song from Bach, which is then interrupted by kind of like a screeching halt of kind of like I don't even know how to call it, cyberpunk effect. That's like the DVD stops or something. I'm sorry, it's getting late.
oh
Matthew
yeah, it
Jerome
is.
says, if anything can be said absolutely here, it is that the German influence on global socio-political development, for better or worse, cannot be understated. I think
Yeah,
so. Yeah. What do you think?
that was. I mean that was my graduate work. Was ultimately it was the um, effect of German ideological developments on the American 19th century. And there are a lot
Yeah.
of them. There are a lot of them.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because we're not. I mean, we're not the French. Uh, um, but we take up a similar role, even though we're not that much known for our philosophy. And I think it in part has to do because we just import all of the issues from all of Europe and kind of like spit them back out. So we kind of like take the English issues of the day and the Austrian issues of the day and the Russian issues of the day. All of them kind of meet up with us, and sometimes physically. And so we kind of bring forth collective, a collective uh, yeah, condensation of that. I mean, you could also go into the whole like. I think one of the channels I advertised in is more a kind of like, let's say, obsessed with pre civilization history and like older like antique stuff, and of course in their thinking, you have the idea of blood memory and stuff like that. And there's a case to be made that Germany is just the country left over of all the Gothic tribes that kind of disseminate throughout Europe. So, like every major tribe makes its own country: the Franks, the Visigoths, the Lombards and so on and so forth. These are all Gothic tribes, and then like the Gothic tribes who don't make their own country, they're kind of like in the north of the HRE basically, right? So you could say maybe we're just the genetic memory or something like that
Well, that
of
is interesting because you know how there's this phenomenon that the closer you are to the inception point of a pop, this is an ecological phenomenon. The closer you are to the geographic origin point of any particular, species, the more genetic diversity you're going to find there. And then, of course, if you think about that, and you think of the Holy Roman Empire is like about 800 different tiny states.
yeah.
I don't know how far I would want to chase that analogy though, because you get yourself in trouble real fast.
Yeah, you can get in trouble definitely, especially with modern sensibilities about the place of genetics and the kind of place of how a people functions. And this would be more of again like a Jungian take, I would say. And then it can get into like Blavatsky and stuff like that, where it's like, or like Evola, where it's kind of like spiritual racism. Where it's like, oh, the German race has like the spirit of all the white people or something. But yeah, I think it's interesting that Germany is kind of the amalgamation of European culture, and it's also the complete like the well the German peoples, not like us here in the Bundesland, Bundesrepublik, but the German peoples are the European peoples. We are all Visigothic and Ostrogothic peoples. Andrew Karma says, man, Germany sounds pretty Wagma. Just look at their experts. I'm guessing that's like a Ligma joke. It's like I'm supposed to ask, what is Wagma? And then Camus is going to completely own me in chat in a minute, I hope. So,
Yeah,
what is
yeah,
Wagma?
yeah.
Uh, okay, but we broke the 2 hour mark. Is there anything you want to finally remark on the whole topic, Christopher?
No, no, we got to everything I want to talk about. That's the
Yeah.
first time I've ever gotten. I think it's the first time I've ever done it in 2 hours too. It's very rare for me to get everything I want in 2 hours.
Do you usually take longer?
Well, whenever cause we used to do the shows that I used to do, they would usually be 3 4 hours long because they were really designed. They were designed to. Of course, they weren't on YouTube, but they were designed to mimic the length of an American radio talk show. Because like most of the
Okay.
audience were like blue collar guys that they don't want to go change the radio station, so you give them 3 hours, so they don't have to get up for 3 hours.
Okay. So yeah, I think that's pretty much it. I think we did a pretty in-depth look at Germany and at Prussia and its coming into its kingdom stage. I mean, I wanted this episode also to be this long and to be this in depth because, as I said, I think this is pretty much where all of the future kind of paints itself into the ceiling if you know how to look for it. So yeah, Matthew Jerome says great stream. I thank you. It was great to meet you. I don't know how you liked it, Sandwich, but I very honored, very flattered for you to do this with me, and I hope we can
That was,
continue doing this in the future.
oh yeah, it's the most fun I've had in a while. It's
That's,
good to be back. It's good to be back in the saddle for one thing, but it's like
yeah.
actually getting to talk about history. So most of the stuff that I've done in the past, I'd have to sneak history in, but to just get to talk about history is real fun.
Okay. So yeah, we'll see you guys in the next stream, I guess. I don't know when I'll be doing that, but if so many of you liked it that much, it might be coming sooner rather than later. And that's it from us. Bye bye.